So I am a 26-year-old male and I had been planning a camping trip with my wife and dad for a whole year. I wanted everything to be perfect as we don't get away from town and dive deep into the woods as much as I'd like. This takes place in the very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, my dad decided to go a little early and pick out a good spot for us to camp. To give a layout of where we camped, there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us, and an overlook to the north of us. We camped in the middle between the 2 roads. My wife and I arrived and met my dad down there around 11 a.m. We set up camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the first evening. Right as we got done with dinner, we see this truck circling around our campsite. He went around us several times and finally pulled right into our camp and got out of his truck. He then proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite and how the firewood that was laying around was his. Now in this particular forest, campsites are first come first serve, and my dad had been there since 9 a.m. He then asked if he could camp next to us, and of course being friendly we said yes. We didn't know that when he said next to us he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tents and vehicles that he blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this, being that there were so many other campsites available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyway. Not too long after that, we noticed a white Dodge dually circling around us. We all had an off feeling from this truck because it went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area we were at was popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we decided to go to bed. I was in a deep sleep when out of the woods I wake up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolt up and ask my wife, "What the fuck was that?" About 30 seconds later, we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point, I grab my gun and unzip the tent so we could see out. My dad had left a lantern burning so we could see a little ways into our campsite. At that moment, we see the white Dodge tearing down the road behind us. They continued down the road until they were out of sight. We heard them stop and get out of their truck, slamming the door and screaming. Then they proceeded to get back in their truck and drive very slowly down the other road that was in front of our campsite. At this point, we were terrified, thinking they were coming to rob us, but they kept driving until they were out of sight. Then we heard them shooting. After the gunshots ended, they sped off. At this point, we thought maybe they were just drunk and acting stupid, so we didn't call the cops and we didn't have signal anyway. We just tried to go back to sleep. The next day, we had to make a beer run for my dad. When we made it out of the camping area and hit the main highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped 2 young boys. We assumed they were the ones who were being troublemakers the night before and continued on into town. When we got back to our campsite, the cops were leaving after talking to my dad. They told my dad that the guys in the white dually had gone into the young guys' camp while they were hunting and were robbing them. The young boys walked up on their camp being robbed and the dually guys pulled guns on them, proceeding to rob them at gunpoint. We think if it hadn't have been for those people that camped right on top of us, as strange as it was, they would have robbed us instead. They made our campsite look bigger than it actually was. The people in the white dually were never caught. Me and my boyfriend love to camp. About 2 weeks ago, we decided to go to the coast because we had a Friday off from our classes and university, and decided to hike and camp out for the weekend. We had a 3-day plan to stay in 3 different towns and hike to each place. This story is about the first place we stayed in. The first town was barely a town. It was more like a bunch of small houses and farmlands and very few people. It was off-season, so normally there would be some tourists since the main attraction is a huge abandoned city left over from the times of the ancient Greek civilization. Anyway, since there were 5 to 6 camping grounds available, one of which was highly recommended on TripAdvisor and the likes of, we didn't bother calling beforehand. We simply headed there and then straight to that camping area. Upon reaching it, we saw the gate open. Not really so unusual, but when we entered it, no one seemed to be there. We knocked and called out for someone, but no one responded. Except the outdoor bar was all open with expensive bottles of alcohol lined up and food left on the kitchen table as we saw from the window, so they couldn't have gone far. My boyfriend found it a bit strange they would leave everything open like that, but assuming it was a small community with no crime, we didn't think much. We went to some other camping grounds to ask if they are open. The first one we went to said they were closed because their grounds were very messy these days, but they recommended us another place. We asked them about the first ground we went to, and strangely, the man said don't go there. When we asked why, he said, just don't. I don't really recommend you going there. Anyway, the other place he told us about was also closed, and luckily in the meantime I found a signboard for the first place and it had their number on it. We called them and a man picked up and told us that he and his wife were out for a couple of hours, but would be back by the evening. The place was a bit secluded, but it was quite picturesque, and we set our camp and left. We spent the whole day exploring and hiking around, and after a tiring day around 10 p.m. after dinner, started heading back. This is where things got extra creepy. When we got back, we found the place still empty. My boyfriend called up the owners again and they said they had decided not to return tonight, but that we could leave the money under a table mat by the bar. They said the kitchen and bathrooms are open if we need to use them. The place was dark and the yard where we had set the camp up was huge and without lighting. My boyfriend immediately started to feel a bit uneasy. He was concerned to why two business owners would leave their property completely open to two total strangers with a bar full of unopened bottles and a half-open house. As we walked towards our camp, he kept subtly expressing his uneasiness and kept looking around. He's usually pretty calm, so I told him that if he's really feeling so strongly about this, we can just go to the pension where we had dinner earlier and stay the night there in a hotel room. He opened the flashlight of his phone and kept looking around, getting more and more uneasy. We agreed to pack up our camp and leave. I began to pack it up since it requires a lot of folding and he was already anxious. I told him to just stand and give me light as I pack it up, except he would constantly move the light and check the area, and I kept getting irritated because I could sense his worry, and at the same time I couldn't pack fast enough because I couldn't see. At one point he even told me in a slightly bitchy way to hurry it up. And as soon as I folded the camp, we stuffed it into its bag and hurriedly packed our shit and scooted. He still seemed super anxious and I told him to relax. Just telling this part gives me the chills all over again. The road back to the main area of the town was dark and lonely, and this is when he told me, "There's something I wanted to say, but not while we were still in the grounds." "Well, what is it?" I asked. He hesitated, then said he didn't want to freak me out, but he was sure that he saw someone lurking in the dark behind the wooden cabins and by the bathrooms. Not once, but twice. No one was supposed to be there except us. I got the chills, but I still tried to rationalize it, saying it's a farm area with lots of animals. Maybe it was a dog or cat just moving around. But he was adamant it was a human figure walking like a human would and standing. That is why he kept checking and wanted to hurry so much. And that's why he was telling me to hush up and keep my voice down. I almost had tears in my eyes at this point, and the hair on my back was standing. I kept looking back and almost running at this point to the lighted area of the quiet town, and only really relaxed till we reached the pension and booked a room there, got the key, locked and checked it twice. I am generally a skeptical person, but I really do believe my boyfriend didn't just see things. I don't know who that was back there or what could have happened, if anything, and I don't care to know. This happened to myself and a close friend just last month. Both 23-year-old males. We decided to go on a 2-night camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We are both very comfortable with nature and spend a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, etc. We hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area and we did not expect to run into anyone. Our first night there, as we were sitting around the fire, we saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake around 10:30. This was fairly unusual, however we did not think too much of it. But as time went on, this flashlight kept moving around the lake, getting closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night, and we did not particularly want an unwelcomed guest. Once it was clear that the person or people were heading for our campsite, we moved off into the woods nearby to see who wandered up. I took a small axe with me and he had a .22 rifle. Now we weren't expecting trouble, and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured we might as well cover our bases. Now the moment of truth. The flashlight comes near the light of our fire, and it is one man. He has a beard and is probably in his mid-40s. The scary part was he was carrying what turned out to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times and then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he came out and started yelling, "I know you're out there. Why don't you come and say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree about 50 yards away. That is when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods. He also swung his flashlight around several times. After what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the fire and threw them into the burn. My friend, who had aimed the .22 at the man, asked if he should shoot. I told him absolutely not, unless he spots us and starts to point the gun in our direction. Thankfully, after a little while, the man had moved off from where he had come. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake, ran out, grabbed everything we could fit in my pack, and took off. It was now around 2 or 3 a.m. We ran out of the trail with flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately went to the police department and reported it, where we also spoke with some forest rangers. That was it. I haven't heard anything back from the police. It wasn't mysterious, however, it creeped the hell out of both of us. Let me give you some background information. I'm 18 and living in Dagenham. It's quite a busy area, so there is normally a lot of people around. This particular night, me and my friend, who I'll call Jim, were on our way to camp out at the local park. You were never allowed in there past 10 p.m., so we would have to hide from the park police. The park we were staying at was always busy up until about 9 p.m. Then it turns to a ghost field. Anyway, to the story. We had set out for the park at about 8:30, so that by the time we got there wouldn't be anyone to grass us up. We arrived and everything went according to plan. We had the tent, snacks, portable DVD player, and Pokemon Go at the ready. It was perfect. 10 p.m. came and we heard the police shutting up the gates. They're quite loud, so it's always easy to hear the gates creak. Once we were sure the police left, we decided to whip out our phones and play some Pokemon Go. There was a Pokestop in the park and I had to lure a module to use. We had been playing for about a half an hour when we heard a loud bang come from the gate. Like someone had ran into it. Dagenham's known for its drunks, so we shook it off as nothing. Cut the long story short, we went back to the tent, watched a couple action films, and went to sleep. Not even an hour into sleep and I woke up with a horrible sense of dread. Like someone was watching me. All of my senses were heightened. Something wasn't right. I hear some crunching coming from behind the tent. I thought it must have been a fox until I heard it. Or should I say them speak. I managed to make out the words. "They're gonna hear us. Keep your damn mouth shut." I quietly but violently shook Jim to wake him up and told him what I'd heard. I needed to make sure I wasn't crazy, so I made him listen. While listening, his face turned white. I could see the fear spread across his face. He grabbed my arm hard and whispered, "We need to make a run for it. Just trust me." I didn't hesitate. We're both quite athletic people, so running isn't a problem. We slowly unzipped the tent and with one big breath made a dash for the gate. We heard pounding footsteps and heavy breathing behind us as a guy shouted in a horrible musky voice,
"Oi, slow down. We just want to play with you."
And both of the guys started laughing madly. Like seriously, it was a really fucked up laugh. We made it to the fence and leapt over it with ease. The rest was just a mad dash to my house, which was only around the corner. We made it back, slammed the door, ran up to my room and peeked out of the bedroom window. We saw both guys sprint past my house, both holding something metallic. It was hard to see as it was pitch black due to the street lamp being out. Go figure. At that moment, I turned to Jim and asked why he looked so terrified back in the tent. He then went on to explain what he heard the guy say.
"You grab the small one. The large one's mine. The bigger they are, the more bigger the challenge."
That terrified me. We went back to the tent the next morning and found all of our stuff destroyed. Tent was slashed, portable DVD player was snapped in half, and all of our food was thrown all over the place. We never told anyone. I think we were too proud to say that we ran away. All I know is I'm never going camping again.
My boyfriend and I are a young couple. We decided that we wanted to get away from work and our studies for the weekend, so we took a trip to the nearest hiking trail that is a part of the Appalachian Trail. We decided to leave on a Friday once I got off work and back up the trail in order to camp. I work in a restaurant and it's very difficult to set a time on when I'm going to leave work. I ended up leaving work around 4, but we said that no matter what, we would be going on this trip, and we finally left for the trail. We began hiking around 5:30. My boyfriend was an Eagle Scout, so we had all the necessary supplies for a successful camping trip. A tent, sleeping bags, sleeping pads, pots, pans, stove, clothes, food, and of course, necessary substances to free our minds after the long hike. The first part of the hike was absolutely exhausting. It was all uphill, and we were both carrying at least 40 pounds in our metal-framed backpacks. An hour later, we finally passed the first shelter. If not many of you know, a shelter on this trail is about 10 foot by 15 foot, approximately, log cabin that only has 3 walls, and is open to the outside. It's specifically used as a shelter to sleep in or hide from the rain. Midway through the hike, it began to pour dramatically in the forest. Sooner or later, we were both soaked from head to toe. Thick fog grew quickly, as it had been hot and humid Friday. The trail became very slippery, and our pace slowed down tremendously. We had hoped that we were getting closer to the camping site, but it turned very dark very quickly. We took a rest in the dark as it poured on us, in hopes that we would find our headlamps. Once we found our headlamps, we placed them on our heads, still struggling to balance ourselves on top of the rocky and muddy path. I thought by that point we would never make it to our shelter. We walked, never giving up, although I wanted to. As my socks and shoes were wet, I was tired, hungry, drenched, and cold. The temperature has dropped more than 25 degrees as we made our way up. It was 8:30 when we finally made it through to the second shelter in campgrounds. There was a split in the path. Either you could walk straight to continue to the top of the view, which was about 1.5 miles away, or you could turn slightly to the right and walk to the campgrounds. Or you could take a 90-degree turn to the right, walk down to the shelter. At that point, we were drenched from head to toe and needed to dry off. It was still raining to beat the band, so it would have been nearly impossible to set up our tent and camp. We had decided to stay put at the shelter until the rain calmed down. We didn't hear anyone out the shelter, so I was extremely excited to have the place to ourselves, and take a few tokes, if you know what I mean. After our hike, I was dead set on it. Once we walked down to the shelter and got to the opening, there was a man and a woman in their 60s. We instantly thought to ourselves that they were an older married couple who wanted to get away for the weekend too. We told them that we wouldn't be bothering them for long, so we wet our backpacks down and attempted to dry off. The couple was very welcoming with a lantern and an absorbing towel for me to dry off in. My boyfriend and I took off our shirts since they were both carrying a lot of weight in water. The couple seemed to be very normal. The man brought a cute dog with him that I enjoyed playing with. We began introducing ourselves with our names, where we were from, and what we were doing there. They both said they were in their 60s. Their names were Joe and Maya, and they were just messing around for the weekend. In between sentences, they were taking large gulps of what looked like to be alcohol in their water pack. They said they were just having fun and met online, which veered off into dropping hints that they were on a trail having an affair. The older woman, who says that she comes from West Virginia, strikes me to be very off. It began with her looks, having scraggly, shoulder-length gray hair, with circular glasses resting on her face. Her teeth were very dark, nearly covered with a brown film, as if she used hard drugs in the past. She wore a pullover, hiking boots, and jean shorts that nearly exposed everything. Joe, on the other hand, was just an average white male, who had gray hair, and was a tad overweight. They spoke about their past employments and what they had done in life. Maya said she was a writer, which I admired. Information about ourselves was exchanged too, since they seemed very friendly. I was in a very bad mood though, and very irritable until I smoked some. My boyfriend and I periodically showed each other our phones in order to communicate, as we didn't have a bit of service in the shelter we were at. We agreed that it was okay if we started smoking, since they were becoming drunk. They said they didn't mind, but would like to join. I thought it was absolutely insane that they wanted to smoke at that age. The man only took 2 hits, but the woman took many. She was struggling a lot to even flick the lighter. The guys began their own conversation and the woman and I veered off on ours as well. The woman began with asking me to tell her a story. As she inched closer and closer to me, she asked me to tell her a story. She grew more and more demanding, saying,
"Tell me a story."
My boyfriend and I met online, just as they said they did, so I was going to tell her about the story of how we met. I began the story with, "So you met him online, right?" The woman nearly cuts me off and angrily says, "What? Why would you say that?" I said to her, "You all met online, right?" She nearly cuts me off again and more aggressively says, "Why would you say that?" I said again, "Earlier Joe said you met online, didn't you?" She nearly shouts and growls,
"Why would you say that?"
I wanted to jump away from the conversation. So I asked her, "Well, you're a writer, you said, right? So why don't you tell me one of your best stories?" The woman becomes happy and giggly again, and while swirling her hands around in her head of hair, she said, "Well, I'm a writer in my mind." I was extremely confused and creeped out. I didn't know what to say. I'm the type of person to laugh it off, so that's what I did. She just said she enjoyed being a writer in her mind. I looked over at my boyfriend and Joe's conversation, and it seemed to be as normal as can be. There was absolutely nothing wrong about it, but Maya nearly gave me the chills as she got my attention, getting closer into my face, asking me what I was saying. The problem was that I wasn't saying anything. I was absolutely silent, ignoring her. She began talking to herself. She would make very in-depth hand gestures as she spoke to herself, then would ask me what I was saying to her. I wasn't saying a word, and she would wonder what I was telling her. She would abruptly say, "Yes, no, maybe, no way, yeah, it can't, wait, huh?" As she would rock back and forth, waving her arms around, she began crossing her legs, holding her arms up in the air, above her head. She started to shout,
"Coming out, I'm calling out to all of you, come."
She was nearly talking gibberish. The older man's attention was caught and asked her what in the world she was doing. She said, "I'm calling out, it's witchcraft." I was nearly high and terrified of all my surroundings. It stormed pretty badly in the background and it was black all around us. A small lamplight rested on a beam above our heads in the middle of the wooden shelter. I was wet and very vulnerable. Everything slowly began to get worse that night. Maya kept slurring her words and the man demanded she get into her sleeping bag and sleep. I sat against the wall next to my boyfriend very closely as the man crawled into his sleeping bag and Maya attempted to put her legs in the sleeping bag but couldn't. She moved around for a very long time and finally curled up next to Joe, on top of her sleeping bag. She was probably freezing as it was 35 degrees by 9:30. Only a few minutes passed and we heard Maya whisper. Maya said angrily, "What did you give me?" She growls again, "What did you give me?" The man finally woke up and demanded, "What?" Maya hits him on his back and yells, "What did you give me?" She jumped up immediately facing us. Her eyes were nearly all black, as her pupils were so enlarged. She looked nearly sadistic and yelled at us, "What did he give me?" My boyfriend and I both tensed up, nearly losing our shit. She screams again, "What did he give me?" Even louder, as her voice screeched into my eardrums. She once again turned around to the man, laying down behind him. She slowly whispered into his ear, softly growling, "Did you give me acid?" It began to run through my mind that he drugged her, or she was having a flashback of a bad trip. Joe attempted to calm her down, but she was still restless. She laid down for approximately 5 minutes, but Maya immediately sat up. She faced us with her legs crossed and she stared at us, without breaking contact for at least 5 minutes. She did this every so often, sitting up, staring at us, and laying back down. She would do this over and over again, so we decided to leave immediately. We finally made our way out as she stared at us for one last time. We pitched camp as far away as possible, but I remained sleepless that night in fear Maya would find our tent and crawl into it.
I headed to a WMA in northern Georgia. I had only a short time to scout the area, but I had a basic and experienced plan to go in early and follow a game trail to where it looked like it crossed a river. My plan was to sit quietly until the early morning deer began to move. I arrived at around 4 a.m. and got my basic gear loaded and began my hike to the game trail with no light except a headlamp. When I got to where a few game trails converged near the river crossing, I looked for cover and found an old rocky foundation of some kind with stacked rocks and brush providing ample cover. I set up inside the roughly formed area provided by the rock and vegetation. After about 90 minutes, it was legal hunting hours. I continued to wait, but as the daylight got brighter, I noticed a lot of things around me. I was working as a lineman at the time, and I noticed a yellow tape trampled down on the ground in a few places. The area was very wet, and the yellow tape was covered in dirt and mud. It was similar to the tape we used to keep people out of hazard areas and off of our trailers when they were in use. I noticed the remnants of paint on the ground. Nearly missing lines, similar to what was left when underground utility locates were painted weeks ago. At about 7:45 a.m., I hadn't seen a single sign of deer movement, so I decided to move a bit further into the area. As I got up, I realized I was sitting in what appeared to be a small stone area that was built as a hut or a fort or cabin of some type. The ground had a thin slab and stone was piled up making walls. I walked up to the road that was about 100 feet from where I was sitting. When I got to the road, I saw a display of colorful objects. I walked over to the display and it was a 3-foot tall by 4-foot wide pile of stuffed animals. It had been raining off and on all week and the toy stuffed animals were all soaking wet, covered in splashed up dirt and mud, looking horrible. Affixed to a tree above the stuffed animals was a barely legible sign that was streaking in the rain. It was a memorial for a child that had been murdered in these woods. My mind raced as I realized that the tape on the ground was a police line tape, and that the paint was likely designating the position of the body. I was completely freaked out. I was kneeling at the exact location of a murder scene, or at least where the body was recovered. My hunting was over for the day. I had the shivers for the next few hours after that.
My story involves myself and 3 of my really good friends. Throughout my childhood, I'll have them go by Kevin, Ryan, and Tommy, who I am good friends with to this day. I could not write this story to you without their help, consent, and experiences as well. The story you are about to read is true, and not made up in any way. Regardless, whether we'd been seeing things or not, the reality is, we had an experience, and we experienced something very horrifying the one night at my friend's cabins. We thought long and hard about actually sharing it or not, afraid of being ridiculed, but we are ready to share with the community, and again, you had to be there to experience it. One of my friends had actually suffered a nervous breakdown after the incident, and needed counseling in itself. Regardless, I would like to have you know that I've also been a skeptic on the paranormal, and find it very hard to believe in many aspects, but I love to watch, listen, and read on, simply because I always love to have an open mind in life. An open mind, in my opinion, is a growing one. Whether it's paranormal or not, something was clearly there that night. Now, finally on with the story. During the midsummer, usually around middle of July, who I had mentioned before, all the way through my childhood, always made time to go up to one of my friend's family cabins, way up in the North Forest of Minnesota. The cabin is located on Vermilion Lake. Throughout all of our young years, we would always go, for sure accompanied by friend's dad, Kevin's dad, who owned the cabin, and sometimes a few of our dads as well. Once we were janitors in high school, we felt more mature and old enough to go to the cabin on our own, finally without Kevin's dad or any adult supervision that may have accompanied us. I would like to mention a little information in regards to my friend's cabin to help you picture the scenario. My friend's cabin is very remote and very little, based upon a very large-sized island. Other cabins were on the island, but the next one closest to us was a solid quarter-mile away, at the very least, which you could get to by taking a man-made path around the island. And I want to mention that, to my good friend's cabin, you had to park on a gravel road on the opposite side of the island, as his cabin was on an island, and you had to take his boat across the lake about a half-mile to reach the cabin. This lake is huge. My mind has had a tendency to run around when sleeping there at night, throughout all of my years, for it was a one level with only 2 bedrooms next to one another. A kitchen and living room that was connected with a bathroom in the back of the cabin. And where you slept in the cabin was always at least 1 window in each room, with no curtain on it at all, so it was easy to see outside to the woods and the lake. And this is where my mind would always run. I always thought someone was peering in, and of course, nobody ever was. I had been to this cabin a dozen times throughout my lifespan, and nothing had ever happened. And the older I got, the easier it was to sleep. Now, for the event, we usually would stay a week's worth, or 4 to 5 nights. On the 3rd night during the trip, when we were there on our own finally, We had set up a campfire and had been drinking beer all night. I don't condone underage drinking, by the way. We just happened to sneak some, being the rebels we were. We went to the dock to gaze up at the magnificent stars and enjoy our buzz, when all of a sudden, we heard something out of the water, sound like a fish jumping out to catch a bug. We quickly looked at the lake with curiosity, wondering where the splash came. Having our poles ready 24/7, thankfully the moon was out that night, which helped lit up the lake. Otherwise, it would have been dark as black, with there being no city lights for miles upon us, and we would not have been able to see anything on the lake. Me and one friend, Ryan, began to point out something and saying, "What the hell is that?" After looking closely and finally spotting what he was pointing at, all I can describe is that it simply looked like a head in the middle of the lake just floating about, staring at us directly. It was about 3/4 of a football field length out into the lake from the dock. There is no question that I could see its features. It had long black hair and very palish skin like a face, but I couldn't make out eyes, mouth, nose, or a chin, as if it was just a blob of pale skin with long black hair over it. I'll never forget the feeling that came over me. The hairs on my legs, neck, and arm all stood up, and I was paralyzed on the inside, ready to leave at that moment. But we told ourselves it was just a loon, as these birds are very popular night drifters on the lake doing their hunting, and also have black with white colors on their coats, and hunt by diving deep into the water, holding their breath up to minutes at a time. So it was possible that a loon all of a sudden popped up out of the water after hunting a bit, or at least we tried to convince ourselves into that scenario. All of us having the creeps and noticing it wasn't moving one bit, just treading water in its same place, went back to our campfire and lit it even brighter and headed inside to drink more. I would like to mention that there was a staircase outside my friend's cabin, about 8 stairs in length, down to the bottom where the fire pit was and the dock. We soon forgot about the head, with the help of the beer, until I had to use the bathroom really bad, and the one inside was already preoccupied. I went outside to do my business, since we were in the great outdoors. Where I'd been taking a pee and glancing out to the beautiful moonlit lake, I noticed the black circle object was still there, but about 30 yards closer now, still looking as if it were staring right at me. I could easily see the nose on this thing's face. Again, it was very pale, like it hadn't seen the sun for years. A very, very uneasy feeling came over me, and I immediately went inside and told my other friends to come look, keeping my eyes glued at the door of the cabin. We came outside to see it still looking at us, and if this head was corked up at us with its chin in the air. Nobody dared to go down to the dock anymore, and we immediately went back inside, ruling out the possibility of a loon, because a loon wouldn't have had to tread water in the same spot like that. Eventually, the current would have drifted it somewhere else in a rocking manner. For a loon to stay in the same spot for almost an hour or two made no sense to any of us. This head-like object was stiff as a board and not moving a single muscle, just staring up at us from the deck instead. There was no ripple effect at all from the lake. We said it was just a log and went back in. I could tell everyone else felt uneasy too. A few hours would pass. It was super late into the night at this point, and we needed to sleep. Being my curious self, I looked back outside once more, and the black object had completely vanished. I couldn't help but feel some sense of release, thinking the log must have floated off or just hit shore somewhere. As we slept with the windows open that night, there was no AC in this cabin, and we had to open them or we would fry in this cabin with it being in the middle of summer. Me and my other buddy, Tommy, slept in the living room while my other 2 friends slept in the 2 separate bedrooms with their doors open. Not being able to sleep, but keeping my eyes peeled shut, I began to hear someone walking around at the bottom of the stairs to the cabin, around the campfire at the bottom of the stairs. I thought it was about to shit bricks. No question what or whoever I heard down there was at the dock now, pacing back and forth as it made the sound of a boot clicking on wood. It was as if they weren't sure what to do with themselves. It lasted for about 3 minutes. Wanting to whisper to my buddy, but frozen in fear, I just kept my eyes shut and ears on full alert. The footsteps sounded like they were taking 2 steps up the stairs and then all of a sudden turned around and sounded like they were sprinting down the man-made path. After it sounded like the steps were gone, a couple of minutes had passed. I woke up Tommy asking if he heard the steps, both of us, sitting up. I was startled to my friend, Ryan, walking out of his room saying we need to leave a minute after these steps vanished. He must have heard us talking, so he felt that he could come out as well. But either way, he was waking us up regardless. Something was very disturbing about this expression, and I asked him why. He woke up my other friend Kevin in the other room and said, "Let's go, get to the boat, it's time to go." Asking him, What, Ryan? What the hell's wrong with you?" He explained to us quickly, while grabbing his stuff, and I will never forget what he explained. As none of my other friends will either. He said when he was turning sides on his bed to get it more comfortable, he saw someone peeking through the top right corner of his window, and it quickly shifted out of his view. He said all he saw was one eye, ghostly white skin, and black hair, long down to the window. Again, another thing I would like to add, when we look back at the experience, it chills us to the bone realizing that, since this face was at the top right of the corner of the window in my friend's room that he was sleeping in, this thing either was damn near 8 foot tall, or standing on something like bricks to peek in, or was floating. Ryan continued to say, "Let's fucking go," very seriously. Absolutely disturbed the fuck out of my mind, and feeling like I was going to be sick, and then telling them what my friend and I heard in the living room, we all agreed to pack our stuff and book it to the clearing of the cabin. We always had to clean the cabin before leaving. We locked up as we headed down the stairs, and we saw bare footprints in the dirt heading off the path and all around the cabin. We picked up our step, getting to the boat, not knowing what was watching us or around us. We threw our stuff on the boat and untied it and sped off. I didn't even think about the head in the water anymore, or even to look in the water, thank God. My eyes were just glued on the island, trying to spot anything moving, but I saw nothing. When we had finally gotten our stuff packed in the car and boat tied up, we hopped in the car and took off. We had been driving for about 10 miles, and out of the blue, Ryan, who said he saw the person outside the window, all of a sudden broke down in the car sobbing, saying, "What was it, guys? Oh fuck, what did I see?" We called to tell our parents what happened. On our way back, that Ryan was freaking out, and they told us just to get home safely and quickly. It was late, about 4 or 5 in the morning, but no one slept. It was a very quiet ride home. My friend's dad, who owns the cabin, went up the following weekend and said he experienced nothing while there, but did mention bare footprints were still lingering around, which he thought odd because someone was walking around his property, which bugged him badly. Whatever my one friend saw in the window really hit him hard. After his breakdown, he had trouble sleeping multiple nights, and ended up having to seek some help for a couple of weeks and hop on some sleeping medicine. As time went on, he ended up being fine, but won't sleep next to a window without a curtain. To this day, I cannot explain what happened and why it seemed to happen to us, and I cannot explain what I saw in the lake and what Ryan specifically saw. Nothing has ever happened at the cabin since that night. So, we're told from my friend's dad who owns it, which I believe him. I personally have never decided to go back to the cabin, which really makes me sad because I had a great childhood memories there. Tommy and Kevin both have gone back and been fine, but Ryan refuses to go back, and I'm with him. A lot of people have cabins on this island, so it could have been a prank in the makings that had been busted when Ryan saw the person at the window, or the person possibly wanting to do something worse. I will never be able to explain what was floating in the lake, but the fact that this incident along with bare feet and someone looking at Ryan all happened in the same night seems more than a coincidence.
Whenever I was scared as a kid, my dad had always told me that in life you should not be scared of ghosts. Fear the living because they can actually hurt you. In my late teenage years, I came into some money after my father committed suicide, and I received an inheritance from him. At the time of my dad's passing, he and my mom owned a cabin up in Oregon by Mount Bachelor. The cabin had been put up for sale since my mom could no longer afford the payments, and renting it out was not covering the payments either. The cabin was set to go on the market for sale in less than a month, and was in the process of finalizing all the paperwork with the realtor and lawyer. So for that month's time, the cabin was not going to be rented out any longer, and was going to be vacant. I saw this as a chance to get away for a while and clear my head in light of all the things going on. I quit work, packed up my snowboarding gear, grabbed my dog, and headed up in my dad's car to the cabin. Now this was our family cabin that my parents rented out throughout the year when we were not using it. I had keys to the cabin and also had the codes for the alarm, so I did not feel the need to stop at a rental management company. My first 2 days at the cabin were normal and nothing out of the unusual happened. I spent my days playing with my dog in the snow, snowboarding, and the evenings playing PlayStation or listening to music, drinking, and smoking out on the balcony. I had already stocked up on food, cigarettes, and liquor, so I was pretty much a shut inside from the occasional out to hit the slopes. With my dog as company and DVDs and PlayStation as entertainment, I was quite content and started to feel relaxed after all the drama that had preceded my outing. The cabin itself was 2 stories. The bottom story had the living room and a side guest bedroom along with a small kitchen. Upstairs had another 2 rooms along with a walkout balcony attached to the master bedroom. Most of my time there was spent either in the living room, kitchen, or master bedroom. I never ventured into the other rooms and always kept the doors leading into them shut. Anyhow, the 3rd day came around and I was going through my usual routine of playing with my dog, playing games, and watching DVDs. That day it was pretty much heavy snowfall, so I did not feel like trekking down the hill to the main road in my car and decided to stay in. That's when things started getting a bit weird. In our area there were only 2 other cabins adjacent to ours. All other cabins aside from these 2 were all around a mile away from ours. Surrounding us was mostly forest and very tall pine trees. Both of these cabins were empty, and from the past couple of days I knew that no one was currently staying there. Around midday while outside with my dog, I noticed what looked like footprints in the snow around the area surrounding our cabin. It was still snowing, so the footprints looked semi-fresh, like someone had been there in the last 20 to 30 minutes before me. I thought that maybe someone was staying near the cabin that I may have not noticed. Maybe they were shut-ins like me. Alright, whatever. The prints lead away from my cabin and they disappeared in the snow towards the denser part of the trees. I disregarded the footprints and went back inside. Nighttime came around and I decided to head to bed. My dog was laying on the bed with me when I noticed his ears perk up to a standstill listening position. This was followed by him quickly jumping off the bed and running downstairs to the living room. I lay in bed and stayed silent, and could hear him moving around back and forth downstairs. After around 5 minutes, he ran back upstairs to me and started to do his doggy dance for the sign that he wanted to go outside and pee. Shit. Well, fine. I can't say no to him, so we both went downstairs to the outside driveway for him to do his thing. Only he didn't want to pee. As soon as we were outside, he started to pull on his leash, trying to drag me to where he wanted to go. He kept looking into the dense part of the trees where the prints had been earlier, but he also kept sniffling to the side of the house and looking up towards the roof. After he figured out that I was not going to go where he wanted, he sat himself down and just stared into the darkness. A bit unusual for him, but alright. Maybe there were forest animals out there that he wanted to chase down, but fuck this. I did not want to chance anything, so I pulled him back inside and we both headed back upstairs. Around half an hour later, I was laying in bed when I heard what sounded like hooves walking on my roof. It was only a series of around 6 steps, and I rationalized that it could be a pine cone falling from a tree onto the roof, or maybe a kind-hearted forest animal running around. But here's the thing. The steps seemed to be spaced apart like a man-length stride, so it was really freaking me out. My dog also heard the noise and was quick to run to the balcony screen door expecting for me to let him out. Alright. I'm a tough guy and at the time considered myself to be fairly well built and strong enough to handle myself. So I grabbed my coat and shoes along with my cigarettes and flashlight and went out onto the balcony. Fuck it. As soon as I went outside, I lit up my cigarette and started canvassing the room with my light. Nothing there and the snow on top was undisturbed. Weird. Must have all been in my head. What about the dog hearing the noise? Maybe he was feeding off my fear or paranoia. I started to calm down and relax again. My eyes started to adjust to the darkness, and I kept smoking and just staring at the stars and trees next to our cabin. That's when I saw it. In a tree that was a little taller than our cabin and around 20 feet from the balcony, I saw what looked like a man crouched in a squatting position in between 2 branches. It was squatted on one branch and its arms were extended above its head, holding on to the branch above it. Fuck me. What the fuck is that? I wasn't sure if I was really seeing this thing, and stood there just staring and sat there motionless. I noticed my dog stand up and start pacing behind me and lightly barking at the same time. This thing still didn't move. I put my cigarette out and was debating on shining the light in the thing's direction, but something in my head kept screaming not to, so I walked backwards to the inside of the room and pulled my dog with me. Once inside, I locked the door and shined the light in the thing's direction, but there was nothing there. I shut the curtains to the screen door and retreated back to bed. But later on in the night, I heard light tapping at the screen door, like someone was tapping on the glass with their fingers. It was consistent and did not stop for nearly an hour. My dog seemed to stare at the door, but he wouldn't go near it anymore. The weirdest part was that I had a feeling like someone was inviting me to open the door, but at the same time I kept hearing my dad's voice in my head telling me to stay in bed and not do it. I listened to my dad's voice and stayed where I was. Eventually I passed out and woke up in the morning and everything was normal. The rest of the week I spent there was not eventful, and nothing else out of the ordinary happened. I never found out what it was that was out there, and I'm not sure if I want to. A couple of years ago, 2 friends and I went to a place called Look Rock. It's a concrete observation tower at the top of Chilhowie Mountain in Blount County, Tennessee. To get to the tower, you park in a small pull-off, then walk a paved trail half a mile up the mountain. I've been to this tower many times, and there's usually some kind of energy in the air. You can't see it, but you can feel it. It's like the woods themselves have acquired sentience, and they're just barely tolerating your presence. Anyway, this particular trip was eerily quiet. Typically in the woods you can hear woodsy sounds. Cicadas, wind rustling in the trees, and the occasional animal, but this night was silent. Going back to my simile, it's like the sentient woods were terrified of something, and were paralyzed with fear. The trip up the mountain was uneventful, apart from the general air of creepiness. We went back up to the tower and shot the proverbial shit for a couple of hours. Finally, around 3-ish, we decided it was time to wrap it up. We began to take the trip back down. At the base of the tower, there's a couple of flattish boulders, about 6 feet or so in diameter, placed as a decoration. What I saw on the boulder was the start of a terrifying night. Nobody else in my group noticed, but squatted on the boulder was a solid black form, about 4 to 5 feet tall with deeply glowing red eyes. It stared at us for a second, then vanished into thin air. Assuming my eyes were just fucking with me, I reluctantly carried on past the boulders. The feeling of uneasiness followed us up until about the 30% point. On this trail, there's a point where the trail turns 90 degrees to the right. The trail you're walking on continues forward, but it's just an ATV access for the rangers. About 20 feet or so before the turn, I noticed an extra pair of footsteps. There were only 3 of us, but 4 sets of footsteps. I stopped and looked, and right behind Jay was a 7-foot tallish heat distortion, like when you look over a flaming grill on a summer day. It was vaguely human-shaped. As with the form on the boulder, after looking at it for a few seconds, it vanished. At this point, we double-timed it back to the car. They hadn't seen it, but they felt it. Halfway down the trail, there's a spot where one tree has fallen into the split trunk of another tree, so it forms a kind of triangle against the ground. At the top of the triangle, the same crouched black form with deep red eyes. Once again, it vanished after looking at it. We made it back down to the truck, everything in our minds screaming run. We did about 90 down Foothills Parkway until we made it back to the highway. From there, the trip was uneventful. We dropped Jay off at his house and proceeded to Dee's house. As I was pulling out of Dee's driveway, his phone rang. He answered it, turned pale, and flagged me down. Something had happened at Jay's house. We booked it back to Jay's, where we found every light in his house on. We went in and found him in bed, with a Bible in one hand and a .45 in the other. Jay's bedroom faces a streetlight. Also, in his room, he has a nightlight, a clock, and a stereo, all of which keeps his room fairly well lit. He went to bed, then the room had suddenly gone dark. He could still see the streetlight, the clock, and the stereo, and they were still lit, but they cast no glow into the room. He said he couldn't even see his hand in front of his face. He went on to say that something had put its hand on his throat and growled in his face, then left. By the time we got there, it had already left. Just to be sure, we lined the doors and windows with salt. We never heard from this thing again. To this day, I have no idea what it was, but it's what I picture when someone uses the word imp. We've been back to the tower several times since, but it's never been the same. The woods have always seemed quiet and afraid. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. It took a while to put together and I know you guys really enjoyed the long videos, so I really hope you liked it. Also, shout out to my good friend Swamp Dweller who helped me out at last minute. As you can probably tell, it took a while for me to come out with a new video. I've actually been planning for a while to do more videos more often throughout the week. I was wanting to do about 3 to 4 videos a week. And while working on this, I had some health issues come up. I literally can't hear right now out of my left ear, and I have to go to the doctor for it. So, yeah, it sucks. But anyways, I'm trying not to let my health issues get in the way of making content for you guys because I really love you guys and I hope you enjoy the content that I create. All this being said, I'm not asking for any sympathy or trying to make any excuses. I just want you guys to know what's going on. I'm going to be putting together another compilation video really soon, as I know you guys liked the last one. It'll be about 40 stories and it'll contain stories from like the last 4 to 5 videos I've put out. Then after that, I'll be working on newer videos. As always, I love you all, stay safe, and have an awesome day. And of course, stay hungry. The fuck was that? About 30 seconds later, we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point, I grab my gun and unzip the tent so we could see out. My dad had left a lantern burning so we could see a little ways into our campsite. At that moment, we see the white Dodge tearing down the road behind us. They continued down the road until they were out of sight. We heard them stop and get out of their truck, slamming the door and screaming. Then they proceeded to get back in their truck and drive very slowly down the other road that was in front of our campsite. At this point we were terrified, thinking they were coming to rob us, but they kept driving until they were out of sight. Then we heard them shooting. After the gunshots ended, they sped off. At this point we thought maybe they were just drunk and acting stupid. So we didn't call the cops and we didn't have signal anyway. We just tried to go back to sleep. The next day we had to make a beer run for my dad. When we made it out of the camping area and hit the main highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped 2 young boys. We assumed they were the ones who were being troublemakers the night before and continued on into town. When we got back, so I am a 26-year-old male and I had been planning a camping trip with my wife and dad for a whole year. I wanted everything to be perfect as we don't get away from town and dive deep into the woods as much as I'd like. This takes place in the very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, my dad decided to go a little early and pick out a good spot for us to camp. To give a layout of where we camped, there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us and an overlook to the north of us. We camped in the middle between the 2 roads. My wife and I arrived and met my dad down there around 11 a.m. We set up camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the first evening. Right as we got done with dinner, we see this truck circling around our campsite. He went around us several times and finally pulled right into our camp and got out of his truck. He then proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite and how the firewood that was laying around was his. Now in this particular forest, campsites are first come first serve, and my dad had been there since 9 a.m. He then asked if he could camp next to us, and of course being friendly we said yes. We didn't know that when he said next to us he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tents and vehicles that he blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this, being that there were so many other campsites available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyway. Not too long after that, we noticed a white Dodge dually circling around us. We all had an off feeling from this truck because it went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area we were at was popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we decided to go to bed. I was in a deep sleep when out of the woods I wake up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolt up and ask my wife what the abandoned city left over from the times of the ancient Greek civilization. Anyway, since there were 5 to 6 camping grounds available, one of which was highly recommended on TripAdvisor and the likes of, we didn't bother calling beforehand. We simply headed there and then straight to that camping area. Upon reaching it, we saw the gate open. Not really so unusual, but when we entered it, no one seemed to be there. We knocked and called out for someone, but no one responded. Except the outdoor bar was all open with expensive bottles of alcohol lined up and food left on the kitchen table as we saw from the window, so they couldn't have gone far. My boyfriend found it a bit strange they would leave everything open like that, but assuming it was a small community with no crime, we didn't think much. We went to some other camping grounds to ask if they are open. The first one we went to said they were closed because their grounds were very messy these days, but they recommended us another place. We asked them about the first ground we went to, and strangely, the man said don't go there. When we asked why, he said, just don't. Back to our campsite, the cops were leaving after talking to my dad. They told my dad that the guys in the white dually had gone into the young guys' camp while they were hunting and were robbing them. The young boys walked up on their camp being robbed and the dually guys pulled guns on them, proceeding to rob them at gunpoint. We think if it hadn't have been for those people that camped right on top of us, as strange as it was, they would have robbed us instead. They made our campsite look bigger than it actually was. The people in the white dually were never caught. Me and my boyfriend love to camp. About 2 weeks ago, we decided to go to the coast because we had a Friday off from our classes and university, and decided to hike and camp out for the weekend. We had a 3-day plan to stay in 3 different towns and hike to each place. This story is about the first place we stayed in. The first town was barely a town. It was more like a bunch of small houses and farmlands and very few people. It was off season, so normally there would be some tourists since the main attraction is a huge abandoned